Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Dr. Mahnoor Bangash. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hope you guys are doing well. Topic of this video is active transport. We have two different types of active transport, so I have divided this topic into two different parts. This primary active transport will be discussed in this video and secondary active transport will be discussed in the next video inshallah. But before going to the main topic, I'll just do a revision of types of transport processes across the cell membrane. Transport across cell membrane. There are different types of processes through which the molecules or ions are transported across a cell membrane. They include simple diffusion, which is a non-carrier mediated process, active transport and facilitated diffusion, and they are carrier mediated processes, and osmosis. Active transport. It is defined as the movement of molecules or ions across the cell membrane in combination with carrier proteins against the concentration gradient by using energy. This definition of active transport shows us different characteristics of this process. Number one is that it is carrier mediated. For these molecules or ions to be transported or moved across a membrane, they need to be combined with a carrier protein. Second is that these molecules or ions are moved against the concentration gradient, and for this process to occur, we need energy, a source of energy. This definition of active transport shows us different characteristics of this process. Number one is carrier mediated, which means that these molecules or ions, they need a carrier protein in order to be transported or moved across a membrane. Second is there is movement of molecules or ions against the concentration gradient. And third is that in this process, energy is utilized. Against the concentration gradient means movement of molecules or ions from low concentration gradient towards the high concentration gradient. For example, this is a cell. Inside the cell we have less number of molecules, whereas outside the cell we have greater number of molecules. So active transport is basically movement of these molecules or ions from less concentration or from low concentration towards the high concentration, which is against the concentration gradient. And during this process, ATP or energy is utilized. The examples of molecules or ions that are transported by active transport are sodium, potassium, calcium and hydrogen ions, glucose and amino acid molecule, iodide ions, chloride ions, iron and urate ions. We have two types of active transport processes, the primary active transport and secondary active transport. Primary active transport is defined as movement of molecules or ions across the cell membrane in combination with carrier protein against the concentration gradient using energy derived directly from the breakdown of adenosine phosphate or the ATP. This definition shows us the different characteristics of primary active transport. Number one is that it is carrier mediated. Second is that the movement of molecules or ions is against the concentration gradient. And third is, and most important characteristic which differentiates the primary from secondary active transport, is that here in primary active transport, energy is obtained or derived from the breakdown of this ATP. These are the different pumps or the transmembrane proteins that transport ions across the membrane using active transport process. The sodium potassium ATPase or sodium potassium pump, calcium ATPase or calcium pump, hydrogen potassium ATPase or the proton pump, and each one of these will be discussed separately in detail. But before going to the discussion of those different types of pumps, it is important to know the difference between channel and pump. Although they both are the transmembrane proteins, but the difference is in their function. Okay, so channel is a transmembrane protein which moves the molecules or ions down the concentration gradient without utilization of energy. This diagram here shows lipid bilayer and a transmembrane protein which is functioning as a channel. On this side we have more concentration of molecules, and on this side the concentration is less. So what a channel does is that it will transport these molecules or ions from high concentration towards the low concentration area, and during this process no energy is utilized. Whereas if you want to move these molecules from low concentration towards the high concentration, then that cannot be done by a channel. For that function we have pumps. So pump is a transmembrane protein that moves molecules or ions against the concentration gradient and by utilizing energy. This diagram shows the lipid bilayer and the protein functioning as a pump. On this side the molecules or the ions are in greater concentration, and on this side low concentration. So what pump does is that it moves these molecules or ions from low concentration towards the high concentration area, and during this process energy is utilized, and that energy is basically used by these proteins in order to move these molecules against the concentration gradient. So these are the basic differences between a channel and a pump. Okay, we have two main types of the membrane pumps, ATPases and secondary transporters. ATPases, we have the P-type ATPases, whereas in secondary transporters we have two types, the antiporters and the symporters. These two will be discussed later in the next video under the topic of secondary active transport. These P-type of ATPases are of three types: the sodium potassium ATPases, the calcium ATPases, hydrogen potassium ATPases or pumps. This ASEs is mostly used with enzymes. Then why are these pumps or these transmembrane proteins called ATPases? The reason is that they act as enzymes and break down ATP molecule into ADP and phosphate during the process of active transport. In P-type enzymes, this P stands for phosphate. Why are they called P-type is because during the process of active transport, when ADP is broken down into ADP plus phosphate, this phosphate is accepted by these pumps over the transmembrane proteins, and due to this reason they are called P-type. This phosphate group, it provides energy for these pumps, and they will only be activated for this whole process only when they get phosphorylated or when this phosphate group gets attached to them. This P here, it stands for phosphate. During active transport, when ATP is broken down into ADP and phosphate group, this phosphate group is attached to or accepted by these transmembrane proteins or these pumps, and that process is called phosphorylation. When these pumps gets phosphorylated, they become activated because this phosphate group provides energy to these pumps, and only then they'll start the movement of molecules or ions against the concentration gradient. His sodium-potassium ATPases or pumps is defined as a transmembrane protein that moves 3 sodium ions outside the cell and 2 potassium ions inside the cell by using energy directly from the breakdown of ATP. Okay, this is just a general diagram showing the lipid bilayer, the transmembrane protein, which functions as the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, on the extracellular side, the concentration of sodium ions is high and potassium is low, whereas on the intracellular side, the concentration of sodium is low and potassium is high. And we can see that this pump is transporting 3 sodium ions against the concentration gradient from intracellular fluid or side towards the extracellular side, and 2 potassium ions against the concentration gradient from extracellular towards the intracellular side. And during this process of moving sodium and potassium ions against their concentration gradients, energy is obtained from the breakdown of ATP. So this diagram basically it summarizes this whole function of the sodium potassium pump. Okay, next is the calcium ATPases or the calcium pump. This is defined as a transmembrane protein that moves 2 calcium ions out of the cell against the concentration gradient by using energy directly from the breakdown of ATP. Okay, Okay, this is just a general diagram showing lipid bilayer, the calcium pump, showing the transport of two calcium ions from intracellular to extracellular space against its concentration gradient and by utilizing energy from the breakdown of ATP. Third is the hydrogen potassium ATPase, which is also called proton pump. So it is a transmembrane protein that moves one proton out of the cell and one potassium ion into the cell against the concentration gradient by using energy directly from the breakdown of ATP. Okay, these proton pumps are found in the kidneys and in the parietal cells of stomach, where they're involved in the formation as well as release of the hydrochloric acid. Okay, this is just a general diagram showing movement of potassium and hydrogen ions through this proton pump. So outside the cell we have low potassium concentration and inside the cell we have low proton or the hydrogen ion concentration. So this proton pump will move hydrogen ions from low concentration towards the high concentration, from intracellular to extracellular against the concentration gradient, and during this process, this is just a general diagram showing a proton pump and movement of hydrogen and potassium ions. So outside the cell there is low potassium and inside the cell there is low hydrogen ion concentration. So what proton pumps do, that they will transport hydrogen ions against its concentration gradient from inside the cell to outside the cell, and they will transport potassium ions against their concentration gradient from outside the cell towards the inside of the cell. And during this whole process, energy is utilized by breakdown of ATP. So this was all about active transport and primary active transport, whereas secondary active transport will be discussed in the next video. Hope you guys like this video, and don't forget to like and share the video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.